The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting group. Access Fort Wayne is a department of the Allen County Public Library. If you or anyone you know might be interested in making a television show, please call 260-421-1250.
Hi, welcome to the Mind, Body, Spirit show. It's Dr. Rudy Cashman speaking. I think you're going to really like what I'm speaking about today. Good news on Monday at 10:30 at the Grand Wayne Center. I'm the speaker on Martin Luther King Day, and they picked the subject, stopping, preventing, and reversing diabetes, and a little bit about the life of Martin Luther King. But I wanted to review his life with you in a little more detail. I read his autobiography and his biography, and I must say, I ended up reading it a couple of times, refer to it every day. What a wonderful individual. No one really could equal what he did. So I'm especially honored on this day, but I'm carrying his dream forward. I have my own dream, and I'll discuss that with you. But let's review his life a little bit here. Let me hold up the book, which I encourage you to read, The Autobiography of Martin Luther King, Jr., edited by Claiborne Carson. Right here. If you ever have time, please read it or borrow mine. and so let's go on this trip together. I can't tell you everything, but you'll know more than you probably knew already. And I sure learned a lot. So in the early years, he was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Okay, his father was a minister. The grandfather was a minister. The great-great-father was a minister. I think the wife's father was a minister. So obviously he was born into a great background. So what do you think he'd become? All right, and a minister. So. And Atlanta at that time was sort of the gateway to the South, where obviously slavery had been, and supposedly had been eliminated, but was it really? And his father preached at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. We've all heard about it a little bit. The first couple of years he went to public schools, so he had some idea how segregated children, for example, were taught. And he came obviously from a sort of a little better neighborhood. I mean, there were very poor neighborhoods. He didn't live in that, but being a minister's son, it was a little bit better, but still it was segregated, okay? Then he went to the Booker T. Washington High School for 2 years, a little bit of an upscale high school, but still totally segregated. And the neighborhood he was living in, the people in general were very religious people. And people went to church regularly. And of course, of great value to him. His father was a very strong individual, and who never argued with anybody. Okay, he listened to your ideas, and give you his pretty strict ideas, but I think he really was a very wise man. You know, today we discuss politics and people one side or the other, and people don't hear each other. But his father would look you in the eyes and you listen to what you had to say. So he thought his father had a sense of justice, and you may say things about segregation, you get up on the bus and all these things, but he never really accepted it. He obeyed the law, but he didn't accept it. The mother taught him a sense of self-respect and explained segregation to him. And she said it was a social condition, but that you, Martin Luther, as good as anyone. So that helped, I think, his ego and self-perception. Said you have to accept the law, the social situation, but you don't have to degrade yourself. You're just like any other living human being. Okay. Daddy was dynamic personality, a big guy, weighed 220 pounds. But he had very strong moral and ethical principles. He was president of the NAACP in Atlanta, National Association of Colored People, which was very important to maintain some sense of togetherness. But in Atlanta, there was a very strict system of segregation. Very strict system of segregation, whether it be the lunch counters, the schools, the neighborhood, everything was segregated, although they had been freed in the Civil War. Yeah. And at age 14, he traveled to Dublin, Georgia with his mother in an oratory contest. So he must have been a good speaker because he won it. And his subject was the Negro and the Constitution. So a kind of looking forward type. And part of a speech, I'll read it to you a little bit, was that was in there, and stating that indeed the Negro had civil rights, and a forward-thinking talk he won, but he won the contest with that. And then he went to Morehouse College in 1944, okay? And he got a Bachelor of Arts degree there in 1949, you know, a long time ago. And he was taught a lot of the theories of David Thoreau, you know, a very famous philosopher, wrote a number of books, and he really liked his essays on civil disobedience. That's a lot of Thoreau's theory. So, then he lived in New England for a period of time, where, in essence, living in freedom, they were desegregated there. He, at that time, as a child growing up, sort of revolted against the emotionalism of much of Negro Afro-American religion. You know, the shouting and the stomping. He didn't approve of that, although I've been to black churches and saw that and was more myself entertained by it. And after leaving a church in Fort Wayne, going to a sermon, went for 3 hours, and I went through a lot of that. I'll be honest with you, I actually kind of enjoyed it. And after leaving that church, the Zion Church, over there by St. Francis, where Crystal Bush Thomas is the minister, I was convinced of one thing. They all had faith. I thought every person in that church was a true believer. Mm-hmm. So we all interpret things, differently. Then he went on to the Crozier Seminary, advancing his education. And in 1950, he heard the president of the university, at Howard University in 1950, he went over there to listen to a lecture on Gandhi, the president of India. And he really learned a lot about that, especially peaceful resistance. In other words, to avoid war and more serious things, but not necessarily a war of words, but I'm talking about physical war. So he was exposed to that lecture at that time, and then he graduated in 1951, and then studied the preaching ministry. And I'd like to read to you a little bit what is in this autobiography. And he was reading about and listening to different philosophers, and he wrote some very important things. He said, "It has been my conviction ever since reading Rauschenbusch, that's an author, philosopher, that any religion that professes concern for the souls of men, any religion that professes concern for the souls of men and is not equally concerned about the slums that damn them, where they're living in, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them, is spiritually moribund religion, only waiting for the day to be buried." So he learned there the social aspects of going to church and belief in faith. It is, has been said, any religion that ends with the individual ends. An important concept. It's not just about you, but it's about you and the surroundings that you're living in. The beginning of the path to Martin Luther King. He said, "I feel that preaching is one of the most vital needs of our society if it is used correctly. There's a great paradox in preaching. On the one hand, it may be very helpful. On the other hand, it may be very pernicious. It is my opinion that sincerity is not enough for the preaching ministry. The minister must be both sincere and intelligent. I also think that the minister should possess profundity of conviction. He's got to really be convicted. You really be convinced. We have too many ministers in the pulpit who are great spellbinders, good speakers, and too few who possess spiritual power." Kind of big words, aren't they? "It's my profound conviction that I, as an aspirant for the ministry," talking about himself, "should possess these powers." He realized that was within his heart. I think that preaching should grow out of the experiences of the people, what the people around us are experiencing. Therefore, I, as a minister, must know the problems of the people that I am pastoring to. Interesting. The minister can't just on Sunday, once a week, get on the pulpit and not know the social conditions of the people he's preaching to. Too often, educated ministers leave the people lost in the fog of theological abstraction, say the words of the Bible, rather than presenting that theology in the light of the people's experiences. What's happening to them? It is my conviction that the minister must somehow take profound theological and philosophical views and place them in a concrete framework where they can do something, make it work. Talking about himself, I must forever make the complex simple. They got to understand. Above all, I see the preaching ministry as a dual process. On the one hand, I must attempt to change the soul of the individuals that they would believe. Okay? So that their societies may be changed. Let's face it, that's what Martin Luther King did, and that's what we admire him for. It just wasn't getting up there and reciting the Bible and say, you got to believe, and then he goes home. That's not. On the other hand, I must attempt to change the societies. Therefore, I must be concerned about unemployment, slums, and economic insecurity. I am a profound advocate of the social gospel. And this is what he believed as a young man. Interesting. I think this is very, very powerful, powerful as a young man. So then he studied Marxism, communism, other philosophies. He studied them, concerned about wealth versus poverty, how they intermingle. You got to admit it, he really studied philosophers and philosophies. And he studied capitalism, making a living versus making a life. How are they balanced? We all know some people are very successful in their capitalism. But what kind of life do they have? You need to look at that. Are they related? Are they treating their employees well? Are they billionaires and multimillionaires? And the way I look at it today, are all the employees unhealthy? I know some corporations like that right in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where the company is even doing good things in the community. They're making a lot of money, making people rich, building other buildings, expanding themselves. But when I go look at their employees, they all got diabetes, and they're going to get the 30 diseases at a very young age, and they're blind. Even the people that own the company and run the company, they don't see themselves. Then he studied war, how horrible it is. But sometimes, as much as, eventually he's more into non-war pacifism. But he also says, sometimes it's better than surrendering to the totalitarian system, like of an evil dictator, for example, like Adolf Hitler, under whose administration I lived for a few years, okay? He said, well, there are times you must go to war, but you try to avoid war. You don't look for ways to start a war, unless the oppression is just totally out of hand, okay? Then he went to Philadelphia to listen to a Michael Johnson, who spoke of Gandhi and nonviolent resistance, who used the term satyagraha, a term that I like, which is sati meaning truth, and grapha meaning force. In other words, say the truth. Don't be blind to what they're doing to you. Speak the truth, then apply gentle force to produce a change. March, go and strike, whatever, and see how you do with that. And the potency of that can result in social reform. So what he's saying is, lift the love of Jesus above the interactions between individuals to a powerful and effective social forces on a large scale. So, gentle pressure, information, joining hands, love. You may need to march, you may need to preach, and try to change society. So he was convinced of the natural goodness of man, that actually we are naturally good, and the natural power of human reason. What he's saying is that we are more likely to favor the good over the bad, but not always. And there are people out there, and people can be brainwashed, like racism, like they did in the South, and don't see it anymore. And you have to confront it, but first with love and gentle force, and maybe a strike, maybe marching, maybe holding hands, maybe singing songs before going to war. Okay? So reason, devoid of the purifying power of faith, this is a big one. Reason, devoid, not having of the purification power of faith, can never free itself from distortions and rationalizations. Let's face it, that's what happened in the South, okay? The Southerners went to church. They basically probably had some goodness within them, but convinced themselves that the black population was inferior, that they were just animals. They called them names. They distorted their reality, okay? And their faith really wasn't a true faith. They were not acting like Christians, okay? And Gandhi said, true pacifism is not non-resistance to evil. Let me say that again. True pacifism is not non-resistance to evil, okay? But non-violent resistance to evil, resistance with love. In other words, you resist evil, but you present it in a non-violent way. You give them a hug, you say nice things, you don't argue with them. You may march, you may sing, you may demonstrate, you may preach. So as his strengthened spiritual life through nature was a great help to him too. He would, wherever he lived, he would always try to sit along the river and look at the stars, and an hour at a time. At the last college, he spent an hour on the edge of the campus looking at the Delaware River, because he had read Beecher's book, because Beecher saw God in nature. Mm-hmm. And Beecher said, and I really like this quote, nature is God's tongue. Nature is God's tongue. I'll be honest with you, that's me. I think that's me. I haven't even read that, but every morning I get up and I'm concerned. My cats are laying on my chest and giving me a hug, and I'm looking at the bird feeders and I'm seeing the birds, I see the deer. I even have a woodchuck living under my house named Woody. Yeah, I feed Woody. My house is not falling down. I take a walk in nature, I commune in nature. I call it forest bathing. And the birds sing at me, and I look at the trees and the leaves, and I may be singing a song. So I think I got to say, nature is God's tongue. That quote, I think, will be with me forever. And I read it in his book, and it's interesting that I did that without reading about it. And he went to Boston University, and he met his wife there, Coretta, and she was a singer. Yeah, she was very good, even an operatic singer. But she decided to spend her life with him. and not go on stage. But she is a very talented person. And his first pastorate, when he finally did get a job, was in Montgomery. In Montgomery, and he joined, and he insisted that every parishioner that he had to join the NAACP, and then they registered to vote. What a wonderful thing. Yes, I myself belong to the Martin Luther King Club. Mm-hmm. I belong to the NAACP. Yeah, it was years ago, maybe 10 years ago, that I joined when I was working in the community, teaching, even marching, anti-violence parade we had a couple of times. I was right on the stage at that time. And then within a year and a half or so, he had his first child. And it even has in this book, so I'm not making it up, the child weighed 9 pounds. Now I say to myself, what I know about medicine, not to be judgmental, but a 9-pound child usually means maybe one of the parents is diabetic. Could be. I don't know that for certain. I don't know what their situation was, but many times what the parents are eating in their genetic structure and what they're eating when the child is still growing in the belly, what they're eating affects the child, so you can be underweight, overweight. I'm not saying that's the answer, but you wonder about it. And what am I speaking about on Monday? The Martin Luther King function, diabetes. It's rampant. It's rampant. Among all people, probably if tested properly, 70% of the white people are diabetic. Yeah, they just don't know it. And 90% of the black community, nothing to do with the skin colors. They're eating different food. That's most of it. Some of it's genetics, but most of it's type of food. So the civil rights movement sort of began in Montgomery when he was there. Okay, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up a seat in the bus. At that time, blacks had to give up their seat in the bus for a white person, and had to sit at the back of the bus. Mm-hmm. That was local law, in spite of the Revolutionary War. Mm-hmm. And she refused to give it up, and Martin Luther didn't tell her to do that, and she was arrested for that. And there was another person in town, Robert Abernathy, also a minister, and he worked with Martin Luther, and and they were looking at it from a moral standpoint, a religious standpoint, and they would preach about it, and he joined other social organizations in Montgomery, and the movement slowly began. And in February 1956, a grand jury indicts Dr. King and others as leaders of an MIA organization in Montgomery, and he was on March 22nd. Was sentenced $500 and 386 days in jail. November 13th, the Supreme Court declared segregation law was illegal, that the local laws were illegal. And in December 21st, King rides the first desegregated bus, and the buses were desegregated at last. And so he started a pilgrimage to nonviolence. Okay, in February 1959, the Martin Luther King went to India with Coretta, and he met the Prime Minister Nehru, and he literally toured most of India railroads, buses, horses, you name it. He was there about a month. He was worshipped, but really, frankly, by the Indian people, because they themselves also had people who were still in bondage, like the non-touchables, for example. For 2,000 years, the Indian country had the non-touchables who lived on the ground in tents, and so they had their own problems over there. Okay, but he learned a lot about non-violence. The British had taken over India, and that's how Nero was able to get rid of the British people through non-violence. Remember, he marched to the sea, even used the salt thing, which was priced much too high, which the British government regulated, and eventually he was assassinated over it. And then Martin Luther King, 310, went to Jerusalem and Cairo, and then he came back. And then in Montgomery, they had a boycott to carry this further on with the MIA Foundation and the NAACP. But Gandhi was the guiding light. Nonviolence, nonviolent to cause social change. Seems to me we could have a little of that in this country. Just my opinion. Okay, try nonviolence first. So he had many close brushes with death, because now and then they throw a bomb here and there. And then around 1958 or so, he was stabbed by a mentally deranged individual, and he almost died. But survived that. And I think it happened actually in Harlem, I think. And then 1958, King is again arrested, and it was September 20th, 58 is the time when he was stabbed in Harlem by a mentally deranged black woman, actually. Attention was brought to them, so they were looked at as brothers, examined by the government. I mean, the leaders of the government started looking at them as a threat, and when they were in India, the group of 20 or so started singing some Indian spirituals, and the whole country started listening to the spiritual, because they had their problems. And for example, in India, there were huge owners of land, huge, but there were many people who had nothing. So they did have some land reform eventually, and small towns were created by land that the real rich landowners gave up. So they did have some land reform, and their lives shone through the darkness, and they related to nature a lot. And so did Martin Luther King, so the Indian people said, Gandhi said, I'm not God, I'm not perfect, I make mistakes, I'm not infallible. You know, most of the time he just walked around with short skirt, actually, a cane at times, and he never pretended that he was God or perfect or anything. He readily admitted his mistakes and related to the people. So when I was giving a lecture today in Warsaw, trying to tell people to eat better, I even admitted that now and then I eat a donut. People like their leaders not to be perfect, you know, with reasonable things, okay? And so Gandhi was like that. People just worship him. And what we're really saying is maybe the Russia, and he was thinking at that time that maybe in the 59 or so, the Russia and the U.S. should disarm themselves. India, he said, was a good example. Although the latest conflicts with the Muslims. I mean, it's not all over, but it's mainly been social. It's been social. They're not bringing out the A-bombs or the tanks, okay? So Gandhi broke the back of the British Empire, but in the country, you won't believe this, they have 70 million untouchables. These were people who've been that way for 2,000 years. They economically oppressed them. Mm-hmm. Sound familiar? That sound familiar? What Martin Luther King went through and his people, okay? Economic suppression. And Martin Luther King once wondered, are we the untouchables? We have 20 million untouchables living in the United States. And he thought, are we prisoners or untouchable of the industry? 20 million people. Mm-hmm. For 2,000 years, the Indians were that way, but now government law brought on by Gandhi, that no longer exists, okay? And but the untouchables were almost starved, almost dead. But eventually he signed agreements, and they're all equal. So Lincoln, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. Lincoln was assassinated, Gandhi was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and their shots belong to history. They are now in history. February 1960, he moved to Atlanta and became pastor at his father's church. The Ebenezer Baptist Church, became pastor there. He also became president of the Student Nonviolent Committee, SNCC, the Southern, and also another organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. These were organizations trying to advance civil rights. In 1960, in Atlanta, they started the sit-in movement. Students were sitting in at lunch counters. You couldn't go to a restaurant. You have to sit in the corner. And the students got involved, city after city after city, okay? And what they copied was what they had done in Africa, yeah. And there was a liberation movement in Africa, and it affected the American students. Now the students got involved and helped Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King said, this was a turning point in my life. Kind of interesting. It was a turning point in his life. And he was constantly getting arrested. They were trying to destroy him mentally, and he was constantly on trial. And then eventually President Kennedy became involved. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, helped. The President Kennedy at first kind of a hands-off. He didn't exactly come out and help him right away, but eventually he got involved, and Robert Kennedy helped him, and then he was arrested again in 1960 for a traffic violation, and eventually they were constantly advancing, and the president started helping, okay? But he realized, too, that human beings, with all their faults and strengths, constitute the mechanism of social, but attacking the economic power is very important. The economic, the political, just like health, and today, it's economic. The government supports the price of high fructose corn syrup. So economics and freedoms go together. We'll keep the jobs, and we'll give you the churches, for example. Okay? So then the campaign moved to Birmingham, and things heated up. That's a huge industrial center. And the civil rights movement became much more active. But they still had Jim Crow schools. Blacks had to go to black schools, and they closed the parks, and even gave them the whites in Birmingham even gave up the baseball team, and instead of integrating it, they moved out of town. And then Martin Luther started what's called Project C. Him and a Fred Shuttleworth, a reverend, and they were going to bring this to a head politically, to produce change. There was a racist leader named Bull Connor, who was a full-time, highly racist political figure, and things would get bombed. Some churches would get bombed, and it was. But they formed Project C to really push this forward, and it started as a movement. They had many meetings, which eventually resulted in a march on Washington, and it's interesting because I started my residency at Georgetown neurosurgery training July 1, 1963. Yeah. And in August one time, I was, I didn't read the paper because I was busy working day and night. I'm driving across town, and there's this huge group of people. I had to stop the car. So I got out, and I mingled with the crowd. I had no idea what it was all about. And it was right by the Lincoln Memorial. And this huge crowd was there, and I was hearing some words, a number of speeches there. It was the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. I was there. I mingled. I didn't hear every word of it, but I heard a lot of it. And I think it woke me up, okay? It woke me up. And with that, I'm going to take you a few minutes and read you part of the speech, okay? This is August 1963. I'm happy to join you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American, meaning Lincoln, of course, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, statue is behind me, okay, signed the Emancipation Proclamation after the Civil War. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves. Remember, they were slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice, working every day, not getting paid. Many getting beat up, many getting, even some were killed. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. Economic injustice, social injustice. "100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives in a lonely island of poverty in the midst of vast oceans of prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land." Mm-hmm. That's how it was in the South. And so we come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was full heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, should be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as our citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Injustice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We've also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. You can get it in 50 years. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and the desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality of all God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there's an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. What do you think? I'm standing there listening to this. Those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there's something I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice in the process of gaining a rightful place. We must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. See, speaking anti-violence here. Let's not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. How about today? Could we use a dose of this today? We must forever conduct our struggle on the plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to generate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. Gentle pressure, faith, and soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. Maybe Iranians too. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inexorably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back, but it's nonviolence. I love the letter to the editor today written by 4 sisters, religious sisters, about nonviolence in today's Journal Gazette. Read it. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. I've always said, in Sweden, for example, and I've even said it to the police chief here, in Sweden, the first thing, no matter what the situation, the policeman will say, citizen, sir, or ma'am, and the person that's speaking to will say, officer, sir, or ma'am. Every time they meet is what they say. Could you imagine if we did that in Fort Wayne, Indiana? I suggested it to a captain of the police. He just stared at me. I think it'd be a good idea. Show respect for each other no matter what the situation, and so it could be at home. So it could be at home. And the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating "for whites only." We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, no, no. We are not satisfied. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Ready to vote. 100%. I'm not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not swallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out of true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day in the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Can't be done. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state of sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I wonder if they're there yet. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation that will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream. I have a dream. I have a dream that one day down in Atlanta with this vicious racist, with this governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley should be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh will see it together. This is our hope. This is the truth that I will go back to the South with. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jagged discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we'll be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with a new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must be true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightened Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from the Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from the Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountain sign. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we follow the freedom ring, we will let it ring from every village, every hamlet, From every state and every city, we'll be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men, white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Isn't that a wonderful speech? I'm so happy that I was there and so glad to reread it. I encourage you to read this autobiography of Martin Luther Jr. Obviously not written by him because he was shot, but Claiborne Carson knew everything in detail, researched it in great detail, and put this book together. Now I think you know where I come from, and now I teach mind-body connection, mind-body-spirit connection, which is today's lecture, but I also teach a lot of health. There are a lot of health issues in this community, our community, and a lot of it's related to type 2 diabetes and there's 30 to 50 diseases. I hope you see. I have a show on that half hour, Monday 6:30, Public Access TV, who we thank for giving this opportunity that you would watch that. You can go to Rudy Cashman YouTube, see 1,000 TV shows for 1 hour. If you just want to say diabetes, 50 shows will show up. So we can, this is about information. I'm for nonviolence. I'm for hugging our health problems and then doing something about it. And for that you need information. I will give you the information, but you must participate to use the information. You can't just accept the present health situation because to me, it's a new slavery. It's a new slavery. We were becoming enslaved by bad food. You need to help me. My last book I wrote is Frankie Rudy's War on Diabetes. Yeah, because we have to gently, with love, resist it, change, and now become healthy again through gentle pressure and through love. Maybe through Satya Grande. I think I like that term. I hope you watch my other shows. You can go YouTube, Rudy Cashman, 1,000 TV shows, or specifically name the subject you want, then just a few show up to save you some surfing. It's also on FM radio 95.7 through the public library. I give many lectures, so you can go on Rudy Cashman Facebook, get a copy of when I do these things. Like this morning, I was in Warsaw, 62 people. I mean, I really loved it. They're changing. Mm-hmm. They're changing. And why did I do this? Care about you. I love you. And maybe I'll see you at 10:30, Grand Wayne Center, Martin Luther King celebration. And I'll be speaking about 30 minutes. I have a booth there. You can come talk to me. I'm even going to give away some books for free. Okay. Thanks so much for listening. See you soon. And namaste.
The views and opinions expressed do not